On March 1, 1953, Joseph Stalin lay motionless on the floor of his Kuntsevo dacha. He was 74 years old. The dacha stood west of Moscow, behind guarded doors and layers of security, yet no guard entered his room for hours. His body remained on the floor. The room stayed closed. Silence held at the door. The guards knew whose room it was, and they knew that entering without permission could bring punishment. Stalin had controlled the fate of millions. On that floor, he could not command anyone to move. The delay became its own event. Guards waited outside. They did not force the door. They did not decide that the man inside needed help. The smell of bodily fluids reached the closed room and the corridor beyond it. Still, the men assigned to protect him remained outside. That fear had been built over years. Stalin's evenings often ended with films, food, and long dinners with his closest associates. He had once worked through the night shaping the Soviet Union. By 1953, he spent late hours at the dacha with the men nearest to power. Every guest understood that Stalin's favor could change without warning. The residence looked modest from outside. Inside, it held the privileges of the ruler who used it. Security watched the grounds. Conversations could be recorded. Movements could be tracked. Nobody at the dacha acted freely. That night, Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin had been among Stalin's dinner guests. Beria led the security services. Malenkov stood close to the center of government. Khrushchev had risen through the party. Bulganin held high office. Each man depended on Stalin's decisions. Then Stalin stopped answering. The guests and guards faced the locked door. No one wanted to be first. No one wanted to take responsibility for calling a doctor. They argued over medical help while Stalin lay without movement on the floor. The contrast was plain. A man whose orders reached across the Soviet Union now waited behind his own door. His closest associates argued over a doctor. Authority had filled the dacha for years. At that moment, it produced hesitation. Stalin died on March 5, 1953. But on the first day, inside the Kuntsevo dacha, the decision on medical help still had not been made. No one at the table broke the paralysis. Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin waited for Stalin's permission to act. Beria had led the state security bodies. He also sat in the Communist Party Central Committee's Politburo. His basement offices in Lubyanka prison became the final destination for many people Stalin named enemies. Crystal glasses held Georgian wine. A pause came before every reply. The guests had signed death warrants and controlled deportations. They had also removed rivals. Their personal competition kept them apart when a common decision mattered most. Each man watched Stalin closely, measuring words, laughter, and silence. Traditional Russian dishes arrived on fine china. Paintings of Soviet history covered the walls. The meal continued past midnight, as it often did. Stalin joked and recalled earlier years. His mustache remained neatly groomed. His eyes stayed sharp in the late hour. No one at the table knew this was his final evening as ruler of the Soviet Union. Behind their decisions stood signed death warrants and deportation orders. Behind the guarded door, the meal continued, and a single remark could alter a guest's standing. On February 28, 1953, Stalin kept his guests at the table as the night deepened. He returned to the defeat of Nazi Germany, presenting victory as proof of his own leadership. He linked Soviet industrialization to his decisions. He also spoke of the nuclear arsenal. The first Soviet atomic bomb test had taken place in 1949. Stalin treated that achievement as part of his personal record. His guests listened carefully. Every response carried weight. Beria and Khrushchev traded barbed remarks across the table, then held their forced smiles in place. Malenkov spoke less and watched the exchanges. The conversation moved between state matters and personal rivalry without a clear break. Public achievements gave Stalin the subject. Mutual distrust kept the others cautious. Hours passed after midnight. The voices at the table continued despite the guests' fatigue, because none of them could choose when the evening ended. Stalin remained engaged by the company and the argument. His subordinates had long adjusted their schedules to his late-night habits, whatever those hours demanded from their private lives. After midnight, the guests moved from the table to a Soviet film. Once the conversation gave way to the screen, Stalin kept testing the room. The Soviet film praised the revolution's achievements. He watched each scene closely. Screen light fell across the faces in the room. Stalin commented on actors, historical events, and the political force of each episode. He judged how the film portrayed historical figures and suggested changes to its story. State censors already examined Soviet films before audiences saw them. His remarks reached past the picture. The guests laughed when he laughed. They agreed with his critiques, even when their private views differed. Each answer could be remembered and later turned against its speaker. The film kept running. Inside the closed room, they listened as Stalin continued to judge the past on screen. Near 4 in the morning, the dacha doors began closing behind the last guests. Stalin dismissed them after the long dinner. Each man approached him alone, thanked him for the reception, and reaffirmed loyalty to his leadership. Stalin received the words without discussion. The room emptied. Guests left the dacha and entered official cars waiting outside. The cars carried them toward Moscow, close enough to the Kuntsevo residence for the return to follow immediately after the reception. Their individual farewells ended at the door. Then, the vehicles moved through the night toward the city. By about 4 in the morning, the guests were gone, and the remaining staff entered their required hours of silence. Stalin's schedule changed without warning. After long dinners, he could sleep until late afternoon. Guards and housekeepers crossed the corridors without a sound. Each person had a separate duty. Their schedules reduced direct contact with Stalin while preparing everything he might need before he woke. Kuntsevo was a closed state residence where guards and household staff followed separate routines. A door, a step, or any other noise could bring an outburst of anger during his sleep. The morning routines continued under the same fear that kept every movement restrained. While guards and kitchen workers carried out their duties, Stalin's personal valet began listening at the door to his quarters. March 1, 1953, began with heavy snow over the Kuntsevo dacha. It was Sunday. Guards remained at their posts while the housekeepers prepared the rooms for the day. Kitchen staff planned the evening meal. The groundskeeper walked the perimeter and checked the estate's security. Snow covered the grounds overnight, but the residence still followed its usual order. Staff opened and closed doors without a sound. They placed each step carefully. Stalin could sleep until late afternoon after long dinners, and nobody wanted to wake him early. Hours passed without a change. Mikhail Butusov had served Stalin for nearly a decade and knew the ordinary signs of activity. During previous illnesses, there had still been movement behind the door. There were footsteps. Water could be heard. Stalin called for service. This morning brought none of it. No footsteps came from the quarters. No water ran. No call for help broke the silence. Mikhail Butusov stood outside the closed door, listening for a sign that never came. He had served Stalin for almost 10 years. His hand stayed near the handle. Butusov had watched his master's health decline. During earlier illnesses, the rooms still carried sound. Footsteps, water, a call for assistance. Stalin's routine remained rigid, even on bad days. This time, nothing moved behind the door. The silence broke that routine. Yet Stalin had forbidden anyone to wake him during his rest. Butusov knew the order. Every servant did. A servant who ignored it could go to prison. Accusations of espionage or treason could follow a minor suspicion. Staff members lost their jobs. Some were arrested. Others disappeared after years of loyal service. That record held Butusov in place. He could hear no movement inside, but opening the door meant acting without permission. Waiting meant leaving Stalin alone. The choice offered no protection. By early evening, Nearly 18 hours had passed since Stalin dismissed his dinner guests. The house still waited outside his rooms. 4 days later, on March 5, 1953, Stalin died. For the valet, disturbing Stalin's rest could end in prison or a worse punishment. By evening, the valet still paced outside Stalin's closed private rooms. Nearly 18 hours had passed since the guests left. No order came from inside. Butusov waited near the door and measured every step. His duty told him to check on Stalin. Stalin's own rules stopped him. A wrong decision could bring prison or a worse punishment. The household staff gathered in quiet groups and discussed the unusual silence. Some thought Stalin might be ill. Others thought he had simply slept longer than usual. No one voiced the deeper suspicion. The cook had prepared Stalin's meals for more than 15 years. That evening, she received no instruction about dinner. Stalin approved changes to his menu himself. The missing order made the silence harder to ignore. Footsteps passed along the corridor. Voices dropped when someone approached the door. The head of security received notice of the problem. He also faced Stalin's direct ban on entering without explicit permission. The order covered private rooms, even when something seemed wrong. Guards had no instruction that allowed them to act. The closed door held everyone outside. By the evening of March 1st, the restrictions still held, but the valet could no longer wait outside. Each hour had added to the staff's concern. Stalin remained alone in his private rooms. People moved through the dacha corridor and returned to their duties. No one had clear permission to cross that door. The valet feared entering without an order. Yet the delay had already become too long to ignore. Night had fallen over the dacha. The servants knew Stalin had given no instructions for the evening meal. Their concern rose as the room stayed silent, while the man inside received no help. After that long wait, the valet made his decision. At about 6:30 in the evening, he entered Stalin's private rooms. Beyond the private rooms, the valet found Stalin on the floor of his study. The door opened with a creak, heavy curtains blocked the light, and tobacco hung in the air. Stalin lay beside his desk after many hours without help. His clothes were soiled, his face looked pale, while each breath came hard and uneven. The valet saw no clear response from the man on the floor. He had entered a room where Stalin usually gave orders. Now, the room held only silence, strained breathing, and scattered objects. Papers covered the floor near the desk. They suggested that Stalin had been working before he fell. A glass lay shattered nearby. Its water had long since dried. The chair behind the desk had tipped over, leaving the study disturbed by the fall. The valet could see the signs, but they gave him no diagnosis and no clear instruction. Stalin remained on the floor, pale and breathing irregularly. The broken glass, papers on the floor, and overturned chair stayed beside the desk. That scene demanded help. Butasov's first instinct was to call someone. Then he stopped. Stalin's private rooms had rules, yet those rules gave no instruction for a fallen master. Nothing covered this moment. Butasov had to decide whom to tell. Calling a doctor could violate Stalin's privacy if Stalin recovered. Waiting could expose the valet to blame if Stalin died. Neither choice felt protected. The fear came first. He weighed the consequences while Stalin remained on the floor, breathing with difficulty. The household's orders had made access to those rooms a matter of permission. Now permission itself was unclear. Butasov had to report what he found to the chief of security, accepting the risk of breaking those orders. Colonel Ivan Krustelev reached the dacha within minutes after Butasov reported the man lying on the floor. He had served inside Stalin's circle for years. He had seen purges. He had seen executions. Krustelev looked at Stalin and understood that delay now carried consequences, yet habit stopped him from giving an order. His career had taught him to follow instructions exactly. Initiative could become an accusation. A wrong decision near Stalin could destroy the man who made it. Butasov and Krustelev spoke in low, urgent voices beside the fallen leader. They discussed calling a doctor. They discussed Stalin's political allies. They even considered whether they should move him into a more dignified position. Every option brought a different danger, and neither man could tell which danger mattered most. Meanwhile, Stalin's breathing grew shallower. His skin became paler, and his body temperature began to fall. The medical emergency stood in front of them. So did the risk of acting without permission. Krustalev and Butasov continued their argument beside Stalin, while the call for help remained undone. Within an hour, Beria reached the dacha with Melenkov. The unanswered request for help had now become their problem. Beria looked first at the people nearby. He asked who knew Stalin had fallen, who had seen him, who had heard the call. Melenkov moved to the timeline. When had Stalin last appeared? Who found him? Had anyone contacted physicians? The answers came in whispers. Both men kept looking toward Stalin's body on the floor. His condition was visible. His breathing had weakened. His skin had paled. Yet Beria did not begin with treatment. He began with witnesses. Melenkov followed the same path. He counted the people already involved and the decisions still waiting. Each question narrowed the circle around the dacha. They agreed to limit who received the news. Fewer people would know Stalin's condition. Fewer people could carry it beyond the house. Medical help still waited. Beria and Melenkov described Stalin as stable despite his obvious illness. They told themselves that several more hours would not change his recovery. Those hours gave them time to consider what came after him. The decision delayed the physicians. It also gave Beria and Malenkov time to prepare for the political crisis. The pause in medical help brought new orders to the guards outside the dacha. Beria took control of the doors, the corridors, and every route into the building. No one could enter without his permission. No one could leave. Guards received the instruction in short phrases. They closed off access to the dacha and watched every movement around it. Beria also ordered them to control the communications. Calls and messages now passed through men who answered to him. Stalin lay inside, unable to speak, while information about his condition stayed behind closed doors. That secrecy had a purpose. The fewer people who knew what had happened, the fewer people could act on it. Beria did not need public statements or formal announcements. He needed time, control over the entrances, and control over the news leaving the dacha. Malenkov faced another part of the crisis. Stalin's death would leave offices empty and decisions waiting for someone to make them. Malenkov considered the positions that would need new holders and the orders that could not remain unanswered. The immediate problem was not only Stalin's condition, it was who would speak and decide once he could no longer do either. The two men then sent urgent messages to Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin. The summons demanded that they come to the dacha at once. It gave no account of Stalin's collapse. It did not say that he lay helpless in his study. The wording remained deliberately vague. Khrushchev and Bulganin would arrive without knowing what waited behind the guarded doors. Beria and Malenkov kept the information narrow while they gathered the men whose presence would soon matter. The dacha was closed. The lines were watched. Beria and Malenkov called Khrushchev and Bulganin without telling them Stalin's condition. That concealed summons brought Khrushchev to the dacha, where Beria and Malenkov had already seen Stalin's condition. No explanation had come with the call. Shock came first, then anxiety. Khrushchev quickly weighed the political consequences before him. Bulganin arrived soon after, completing the gathering of Stalin's closest leadership. 4 men stood beside their fallen leader. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin said little. Each turned toward the future in silence. That silence carried a decision. The 4 men now argued over when doctors could enter Stalin's rooms. Beria demanded secrecy. Khrushchev pressed Stalin's health and recovery, while Stalin lay motionless beside their discussion. His breathing remained heavy. The delay gave every sentence a second meaning. Beria warned that disclosure could spread panic across the Soviet Union before they understood his condition. Khrushchev kept returning to medical help, insisting that treatment came before political calculation. Hours passed beside the fallen leader. The conversation moved from doctors to death, succession, and control of the country. Beria and Malenkov aligned their positions. Khrushchev and Bulganin searched for their own agreement. Stalin still breathed. That fact kept the argument suspended. Yet the men discussed who could replace him and how each alliance might survive his death. Questions that had been unthinkable days earlier now filled the room. Early on March 2nd, nearly 24 hours after Stalin collapsed, they finally agreed to summon medical assistance. Even then, choosing the doctors created another delay. Stalin had spent his final months accusing Jewish physicians of plotting against Soviet leaders. The campaign, later called the Doctors' Plot, had already removed many experienced doctors through arrest, imprisonment, or execution. Those still practicing feared accusations of sabotage or murder. Only after the long argument did Stalin's inner circle agree to call the doctors. Calling the doctors did not make their choices free. Months earlier, Stalin had targeted Jewish doctors, and experienced physicians were arrested. Those remaining knew his death under their care could bring charges of deliberate harm, then execution. That fear still shaped the room when the medical group finally entered Stalin's study. He had lain on the floor for more than a day without medical help, while his condition worsened hour by hour. The delay was already part of the diagnosis. Some of the specialists had survived the recent purges. They found Stalin in soiled clothing and began the first examination. There was no quick reassurance. The doctors did not offer a final prognosis. Their examination identified an extensive stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage inside the brain. The bleeding had caused major damage, and the group judged Stalin's condition critical. More than a day without help had passed before they could make that finding. His condition had continued to decline throughout the delay. The examination established extensive bleeding in the brain and a patient in critical condition. With the diagnosis on record, physicians stayed beside Stalin's bed as his allies watched every movement. The finding was severe, yet no doctor gave a final forecast. A bleak report could be treated as sabotage, and caution could later look like guilt. Doctors cleaned Stalin and tried to make him more comfortable. That was basic care. Even there, they had little freedom. The stroke had left limited options, while fear narrowed them further. They hesitated over medicines and procedures that might carry risk. If Stalin died, medical reasons might not protect them from blame. His allies questioned each decision. They debated each step. Care became a political test. The doctors treated a patient whose condition was worsening. They also faced men who could turn an unsuccessful choice into evidence of malice. No action seemed free of danger. A decision to intervene could be condemned. A decision to wait could be condemned as well. The room filled with scrutiny instead of certainty. Physicians continued their work under watch, unable to make many choices without fear of accusation. Stalin's condition kept deteriorating while the doctors remained constrained by that fear. Fear still governed the room at the Kuntsevo dacha, Stalin's main Moscow residence, but his body no longer answered it. On March 1st, 1953, he had suffered a stroke. By the passage from March 2nd into March 3rd, his breathing had become labored and his responses came less often. The delay before treatment began had closed the doctor's real chance to restore him. They watched the breathing, they recorded each change. The stroke had caused damage they could describe, but no intervention could change the result. Quiet steps crossed the rooms of the dacha while physicians checked Stalin and added new observations to their notes. His political allies spoke in low voices about what would follow. Household staff kept performing their duties. Old fear still controlled their faces and voices. Yet the silence had changed. Stalin's subordinates began speaking more freely among themselves, though they still lowered their voices near the rooms where he lay. The doctors had moved from treatment to documentation. Heavy breathing, rare responses. A physician's record now described severe damage after the stroke. At the dacha doors, Beria directed the guards and decided who could enter. Stalin's breathing had turned uneven. Every visitor now depended on Beria's orders. Beria was deputy chairman of the Soviet Council of Ministers. He controlled access to the Kuntsevo dacha and the flow of information inside it. Whoever controlled the doors could shape the first decisions before Stalin's death became official. The guards followed his instructions. Khrushchev watched this control with caution. As secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, he knew Beria also held power over the state security bodies. That made Beria a threat. Khrushchev had to find a counterweight while protecting his own position. The doctors stayed beside Stalin. They monitored his condition and entered each change into their records. Their work had narrowed to observation. The breathing broke its rhythm again, and the notes continued. Beria now held the entrance, the guards, and the internal orders at the dacha. The men inside the dacha had controlled the doorway. The doctors now controlled the final record. Their notes turned waiting into an official moment. Near 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died at the Kuntsevo dacha. The room fell quiet. The physicians recorded the time and circumstances of his death. For almost 3 decades, Stalin had led the Soviet Union. That authority ended beside the bed. Those present kept their emotions controlled because open celebration remained unthinkable. Relief stood beside uncertainty. No one said it aloud. Fear did not disappear at once, but it began to loosen as the doctors completed their entry and those around Stalin weighed their next decisions. A medical notation had become a political starting point. Stalin was dead. 9:50 p.m., March 5, 1953. The record ended the waiting. Beria moved before the room had settled into silence. He ordered guards around the Kuntsevo dacha. He controlled who entered, who left, and what could be said. The body remained inside. The first orders concerned the house and the news. That order mattered. Information now had value. For hours before Stalin died, fear had delayed help. Subordinates had found him incapacitated, yet they hesitated to act without direct permission. Nobody wanted to disturb him. Nobody wanted responsibility for a wrong decision. The same fear remained after his death. It had changed direction. Beria understood the opening. He stood close to the flow of reports, medical records, guards, and messages. Every call from the dacha passed through men who knew his authority. Every detail could affect the next decision. The room had become political ground. So had the telephone line. Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union for almost 3 decades. His ministers had learned to wait for his approval, his anger, or his sudden change of mind. Now the approval would never come. The officials around him still had offices, guards, papers, and titles, but nobody knew which order would hold by morning. Beria did not wait for certainty. He began to arrange control. His position gave him access to the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the security services. That gave him access to files, communications, and men trained to obey. In the first hours, he placed himself beside the information moving from the dacha outward. The news could not stay hidden. It had to be shaped. On March 6, 1953, the Soviet authorities issued their official announcement. Radio carried it across the country. Stalin, the announcement said, had died after a brief illness. The sentence was short. Its omissions were larger. It did not describe the long delay before he received help. It did not describe subordinates frozen by fear. It did not describe the hours when Stalin lay incapacitated at the Kuntsevo dacha while men nearby waited for someone else to act. The announcement offered an orderly death. The dacha had seen hesitation. That difference protected the men still in power. A public account of confusion would have exposed the weakness inside the leadership at the moment it needed discipline. The official message gave the country one version, clear enough for radio and newspapers. A leader had died. The state would continue. Outside the dacha, the announcement became a national event. People heard it through radios in apartments, offices, factories, and public spaces. The name that had dominated orders, speeches, portraits, and headlines now appeared in a death notice. There was no open argument on the broadcast, no sign of the struggle beginning behind closed doors. The language stayed formal, the voice stayed controlled. That control was the first task. The leadership also had to choose a visible successor. Georgy Malenkov became chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. The office placed him at the head of the government, but the men around him still measured one another. Beria held power through the security organs. Malenkov held the government post. Others remained close, listening for the next instruction. The death had ended one command. It had not settled the next one. Then came the funeral. On March 9, 1953, Moscow filled with crowds for Stalin's state funeral. People carried portraits of him through the streets. The images showed mourning, order, and continuity. The ceremony placed the dead leader at the center of the capital one more time. Crowds pressed through Moscow. Portraits rose above them. Some mourned with devotion. Others had spent years hearing Stalin praised in public speech and print. Fear, habit, grief, and uncertainty could look alike in a crowd. The funeral did not reveal private thoughts. It displayed the reaction the state could show. The leaders watched that reaction closely. They stood beside the coffin, spoke in public, and appeared together. Their presence said the government still had hands on the levers of power. Behind that display, the contest continued. Each announcement, guard detail, message, and meeting carried weight. Beria had acted first at the dacha because the first control was control of the story. The March 6th announcement remained on the record. Stalin had died after a brief illness. The announcement settled nothing. With Stalin gone, Beria moved to keep the initiative through the security services he controlled. That control placed him at the center of the new leadership. It also made him a target. Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and Vyacheslav Molotov turned against their former ally. Within months, they arranged Beria's arrest and cut him off from the leverage he had tried to preserve. The proceedings stayed secret. The court convicted him of treason, and the trial ended in execution. The man who controlled the security bodies now faced their power himself. Khrushchev then became the leading figure in the new leadership. His rise changed the balance at the top. In 1956, Khrushchev spoke at the 20th Party Congress. He condemned Stalin's cult of personality and disclosed part of the regime's crimes. De-Stalinization had begun. The Communist Party kept its authority. By 1956, the public break with Stalin had begun, yet the doctors at dacha No. 2 still faced questions about every lost minute. The doctors' plot had accused Jewish physicians of planning to kill Soviet leaders. Stalin died. The authorities dropped those charges. The suspicion did not disappear. Doctors who treated Stalin or failed to reach him remained under scrutiny. Investigators arrested or questioned some of them. They alleged medical negligence. They also searched for an imagined conspiracy. The staff at dacha No. 2 faced their own investigation. Documents tracked each action during Stalin's final hours. Each pause at his door drew attention. Entering without permission had once been forbidden. That rule had stopped the staff. Now investigators examined their delay as possible treachery. Fear had first kept them outside the room. Fear then placed them under investigation. The charges in the doctor's plot ended after Stalin's death. The inquiries into dacha No. 2 continued. Every pause outside Stalin's closed room was later examined as a possible act of betrayal. The staff had waited for permission because acting without it could itself bring danger. After his death, that hesitation became evidence against the same people whom fear had kept still. The doctor's case ended, but suspicion did not. Investigators continued to examine the staff of dacha No. 2 and the final 24 hours of Stalin's life. A delay at the door could be read as negligence. It could also be read as involvement in an invented plot. The accusation changed shape, but the threat remained. Surveillance, censorship, and repression continued after Stalin's death, although some of the harshest measures were eased. Suspicion, distrust, conformity, and self-censorship remained in Soviet life for decades. Independent thought still carried risk, and people learned to weigh words before speaking. The crimes of Stalin's rule took decades to confront. and that reckoning remained incomplete. The final 24 hours became the record of a closed door, a waiting staff, and permission that never came. Fear kept them outside. Then investigators examined every minute they had delayed. Like and subscribe for more history.